fights with passion, and he inspires.
Are you ready for a war?
All right, welcome back to From 8 Arbitration, the final episode of my Snow Daze miniseries. I'm still in a hotel, though. Still no power at my house. No power at the post office that I work at, so still in a hotel. And, this is going to be my last episode, though, of Snow Daze. We're going to cover some cites dealing with acts of God. Now, that I read yesterday, 970, had 1,000 cites in it. The problem with that is that I believe it was written in 1990. And so the cites I'm going to use today are post-1990, all right? But based off of the things that I saw on social media, these cites will help you most, all right? I wanted to get some cites that dealt with carriers that came to work, had nothing to do. And management said, hey, you can either sit here all day or take annual and go home. And so I've got some cites on that, okay? And I think these will help you. And I'll tell you the numbers, and you can write them down. But so I've got about, 6 cites. I said I was going to read management's position on them. I'm not. I'm just going to read the arbitrator's discussion because it tells management's position. I would just be reading that to you twice. But, yeah, so you're going to have management's position as well as the arbitrator's decision, okay? And all those will be tied up in the discussion portion of the arbitrator's award, if that makes sense. But I think these will help you, especially those that came to work, made some kind of attempt to come to work, and management said, hey, we have nothing, no mail, no trucks, can't go out, so just sit here all day on a stool or take annual leave. So there's several hundred cites that you can look for or look through, and I found about 6 I believe will really help you on that. But get that 970 I read last night. It's got 1,000 cites, especially an advocate, and that will help you. That did a lot of your homework for you. But I'm just going to go ahead and start with these cites. I've got C30564, 30564, and this is arbitrator Glenda August, all right? And I'm going to go to her discussion. And the reason I like this one is because of her definition of diligence, due diligence, as we say. And she's got the language in there that we've been going over the last 3 or 4 days, 519 of the M. And this is her discussion. And I like this because she's going to explain to you something that management will obviously bring up. She says, when deciding if an act of God occurred, the criterion used is whether the act involved community disasters such as fire, flood, or storms, whether the disaster situation was general rather than personal in scope and impact, and whether it prevented groups of employees from working or reporting to work. In the case of the carriers assigned to Center City Station on February 1st and 2nd of 2011, the facts of the instant case demonstrated that a majority of carriers assigned on the dates in question failed to report for duty. Evidence provided in the moving papers demonstrated that 23 carriers assigned to Center City Station, 6 reported for duty on February 1st, and 10 reported on February 2nd. More than 50% of the employees scheduled were unable to report for duty. Federal, state, and local authorities all declared the storm a state of emergency and engaged emergency workers to protect the citizens of Oklahoma, some of who were stranded on roads while attempting to drive through the storm. Employees of the Postal Service faced the same challenges as others working when attempting to get to work, and as a result, groups of employees were unable to work. The fact of the instant case are different from 1 or 2 employees who live in areas more prone to being inaccessible during snowstorms. The instant grievance presented an overwhelming number of employees who decided not to risk life and heeded the caution of local authorities by not attempting to travel roads which were impassable during the snowstorm. An added requirement of the M is that employees use reasonable diligence, and here's why I love this decision. Employees use reasonable diligence to report for duty, even during storm conditions. In a 1998 decision by arbitrator Charles Frost, arbitrator Frost cited a 1993 decision by arbitrator Alsher, who opined, ELM 519.213 imposes a duty on the postmaster to determine whether an employee who chose to be absent himself from reporting to work exercised reasonable diligence. Reasonable diligence is equivalent to ordinary diligence. The exercise of extraordinary diligence or a high degree of diligence is not required. And I'm going to read that again because management's going to put that burden on us, a higher degree of diligence. Reasonable diligence is equivalent to ordinary diligence. The exercise of extraordinary diligence or a high degree of diligence is not required. An employee, in order to qualify for administrative leave, does not have to expose himself to danger to his person. If the employer had intended to require employees to set aside concerns for their personal safety when faced with a natural disaster, the M would have applied a higher standard, higher than reasonable. The M does not place a number of percentage of employees who must be prevented from reporting to work. It merely states that in determining whether the disaster was general or personal in scope, a determination must be made if the disaster prevented groups of employees from reporting to work. Arbitrator Alsher applied a reasonable person standard to the M requirement for reasonable diligence, and I agree with his findings. While all employees should be expected to continue to report for duty during inclement weather, where rain or snow makes for a dreary day or requires additional clothing and more cautious driving, blizzard situations and storms of the magnitude of that felt on February 1st and 2nd required employees to weigh their options and decide to protect life and limb by staying off the dangerous roads. Specifically, it was noted by this arbitrator that more than 50% of the carriers were unable to report for work on February 1st and 2nd due to the storm. Testimony by the carriers provided efforts made by each individual to report to work. This arbitrator finds that these efforts support the requirement for reasonable diligence under the ELM Section 519. Thus, in the case at bar, the union demonstrated that the storm prevented groups of employees from reporting for duty and thereby meeting their burden. For the foregoing reasons, the grievance is sustained. And that's a beautiful decision where she puts the onus on management. And she said she's not going to elevate ordinary diligence or reasonable diligence. She's not going to make that extraordinary diligence or a higher degree of diligence. She said if the Postal Service wanted to incorporate a higher degree of diligence, they would have put that in the ELM. And that's a beautiful decision. That's a fantastic decision, and that's one that I would always use, okay, because it breaks it down. Reasonable diligence is equivalent to ordinary diligence. I don't have to risk life or limb, and that was what I was saying yesterday. I don't have to risk life or limb to come in to deliver mail. I'm just not going to do it. A lot of cases that I read also, because we do not do very well in act of God grievances. Matter of fact, management wins more than we do when you look at the totals. A lot of those were stating that management did in fact investigate and told the carriers they needed statements, and the carriers refused to write statements. We will always lose when that's the case. The most important thing for any contract case are statements from carriers, especially ones like this. Talk to me about your reasonable diligence to try to get into work. What efforts did you make? If we don't have that, it's going to be very difficult for us. Now, I do have an arbitration case in here where we gave no statements and we still won, but make sure that we provide statements, detailed statements of our efforts, our reasonable diligence to get into work. Management rarely will ever investigate us at the informal level. They're just not going to do it. They're going to deny the administrative leave like most of them. You can either take annual or go home. We're not going to give administrative leave. You've not done any investigating. You just made an arbitrary decision that you're not going to give me administrative leave. When we file the grievance, there's not going to be any investigation by management, and that needs to be a huge contention from us because the informal is too late. Management's already determined that they're going to charge us leave. They're not going to give us admin leave. All right, so that would be a contention. Management at no time interviewed any of the carriers inquiring about their attempts to come into work, their reasonable diligence, okay? And so this is a great decision for you on that. and that's 30564, arbitrator Glenda August. All right, the next one is Zach Morris, and this is a fantastic decision. And Andy Tuttle did it for us, and it's 36279. This is a great one now. This is one I've been talking about. 36279. See, 36279. And I love this language on this one because it's exactly what we're talking about on most of these things that I've been reading off of social media to you. And this is what he says, opinion. I have presided over numerous act of God arbitrations over the years, but this one is unique, at least to my experience. Typically, a storm occurs, employees can't report to work. Management does not grant those employees administrative leave, and a grievance is filed. This one is unique in that many of the employees seeking administrative leave actually did report to work to find that there was no mail to deliver, and were given the option of remaining at work to perform whatever work the postmaster could scrounge up, or using their earned annual leave and going home. 90% of the things that I read to you off of social media was that right there. We came to work, management said, hey, you can sit on a stool all day and do nothing, or take annual leave and go home. This is the decision that you need. All right? It's a fantastic, and I've got another one, but this is the best one because he blasts management in here. Before getting into the choice facing the carriers at Kearney and Ravenna State on this day, however, let's first address the elements required for the union to make a prima facie case under ELM 519. First, the act of God must be a community disaster, such as a fire, a flood, or a storm. There's no doubt that there was a storm, so that much is sorted. Did it rise to the level of a community disaster, though? Arbitrators have different opinions on what types of events rise to the level of a community disaster. Further, location and history are important as well. 5 inches of snow in Buffalo, New York will not have the same impact on the community as 5 inches of snow in Biloxi, Mississippi. Nebraska is no stranger to large amounts of snow, as the service points out, and the municipalities of the state are generally well prepared with snowplows and salt. However, it is important to note that Kearney and Ravenna are in relatively remote and rural parts of Nebraska. As such, their resources are not going to match those of a larger city like Omaha or Lincoln. It snowed all night long on the 18th and into the 19th, with roughly a foot of snow being dropped. Buffalo County Highway Superintendent John Mall wrote that attempts to start clearing snow did not begin until around 4 a.m. and that the majority of county roads were impassable for the one day on January 19th. Roger Peterson, the Kearney City Street Superintendent, echoed this sentiment, writing, conditions made it impossible for any mobility around the town until the following day on Friday, January 20th of 2023. And that's fantastic work on our informal and formal A there. Getting those things offline, putting those in the file, the arbitrator's quoting them right here. That shows the importance of those things. If your mayor is saying, hey, we've got a community disaster, a state of emergency, if you get anything off of Twitter saying that the police have said, stay at home, we've got too many road crews out here trying to fix the roads, we need you to stay off of them. Anything like that, put it in the file. And this shows you why here. This arbitrator is actually quoting those things. The evidence shows that this assessment was not completely true, as there were employees who made it into work with difficulty, to be sure. However, as a whole, the evidence supports the finding that the city was pretty well shut down. Numerous employees submitted statements attesting to their struggles to report to the post office, and the fact that the mail truck could not even get into town until 2:30 in the afternoon is sufficient, in my view, to label this storm as a community disaster. Second, the union must show that an act of God was general in scope rather than personal. This can easily be answered in the affirmative. The entire county of Buffalo was affected by this storm. This is not a situation where one employee decided to live on top of a mountain and they couldn't get out of their driveway, or one employee lived next to a river that flooded. The snowstorm was widespread, affecting every person in town. Third, the union must show that the storm prevented groups of employees from working or reporting to work. This is where I will circle back to the point that I first made. This grievance is unique in that while some employees in the class were prevented from reporting by the storm, others were not. They actually did report to work. By all accounts, Postmaster Ryan gave employees who did take the risk and did report to work the option of staying at the post office and doing some form of work or going home and taking their annual leave. And this is the reason I love this one. This is what we kept reading on social media. This is obviously not a desirable choice. Employees did not want to waste their annual leave on a snow day at home when they could save it up for a vacation. On the other hand, the employees were likely not keen on the idea of staying at work for 8 hours in such conditions with their families at home when there was no mail to deliver. These carriers bid into their positions because they enjoyed delivering mail. It is understandable that they might choose to go home rather than spend 8 hours going through safety training and moving LLVs around the parking lot. However, it is undeniable that these carriers did, in spite of the storm, report to work. It is also undeniable that they could have remained at work but chose to go home. The union submitted an arbitration award very similarly circumstances to the case at bar. Our arbitrator Paul Chapdelaine, a snowstorm fell on Englewood, Colorado from around 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. Around noon, management instructed carriers to abandon their routes and return to the post office. According to arbitrator Chapdelaine's recounting, upon their return to the office, the carriers were instructed to recase the regular mail and DPS mail that they had returned to the office. Once they had completed recasing their mail, the carriers were given the option to remain at the office or to leave and use their annual leave or leave without pay. With the exception of a few individuals, the majority of the carriers left work early and went home. This is remarkably similar to what occurred in Kearney, with the exception that there actually was mail to deliver and that the carriers were called off of their routes in the middle of the day rather than upon reporting to work. Management made similar arguments in that case as well. He summarizes the argument. The carriers who voluntarily elected to leave work early that day could have stayed and completed their 8-hour assignment inside the installation. In determining that the storm did in fact prevent the employees from work, even though it had not prevented them from reporting to work, the arbitrator wrote, all of the union's witnesses testified that they had recased their routes as instructed after returning to the office, and that they were not aware of any other carrier work that remained to be performed in the installation at that point. In addition, no credible evidence was submitted by the service other than the testimony of management to establish that any carrier work remained after the carriers finished recasing their mail. Thus, there was no reasonable excuse for keeping the carriers standing around for the remaining few hours just to fill up their day and avoid paying administrative leave. Arbitrator Chapdelaine also quotes from an award of arbitrator Clark's in case number there, Peter Clark, which also bears striking similarity to the case at bar. In it, arbitrator Clark writes, the bulk of a letter carrier's day is spent on the street delivering mail. No mail came in or left Amarillo on the day in question. What little mail was there already could not be delivered. Therefore, the essential function of a letter carrier was frustrated by the storm. No evidence other than the postal management testimony was presented to indicate that training was available, and, assuming it was available, it was training the individual carrier had not received already, needed, or that would fill an 8-hour day. It would hardly be prudent to force a carrier to attend training he had already received or did not need simply to fill up his day and avoid paying administrative leave. While Postmaster Ryan ran through a list of work that could have been performed that day by the carriers, it seems as if one carrier alone had been able to accomplish it all. Carrier Bruntz's statement indicates that he cased on the full coverages, did the collection runs, and handled the moving of the LLVs. He made no mention of any safety training, and my overall impression is that any work Postmaster Ryan had to offer the letter carriers that day would have amounted to random odd jobs around the post office in order to fill out their workday, and would likely have been very tangentially related to their duties as letter carriers. As such, I find the third requirement of ELM 519-211 has been met. The storm prevented groups of employees from working and reporting to work. As such, by the definition contained in the M, the storm can rightly be categorized as an act of God. Even where an act of God has occurred, however, employees have a responsibility to make diligent efforts to report to work. Some of these employees obviously did report to work and were told they could go home. Others prepared statements detailing their struggles. Further, Postmaster Ryan testified that she made no attempt to interview these employees concerning what diligent efforts they made to report. And this is another great decision here. You're going to cover several facets. Those of you who came into work and they said, hey, just sit on a stool, there's nothing for you to do. If you want to leave, you can take annual. This one's going to address it. Also, further, Postmaster Ryan testified that she made no attempt to interview these employees concerning what diligent efforts they made to report. That's going to help 99% of y'all, because management's not going to take that time to do that. They're just going to deny the administrative leave because their bosses said deny it. And so that's a great decision here. For this reason, I find that the union has met its burden of showing a violation by the Postal Service. As for a remedy, the service argues that an award of administrative leave would constitute unjust enrichment, but I do not agree with that assessment. Administrative leave is designed for situations like this. If it were unjust enrichment to award such a remedy for an act of God, then the ELM 519-215 would not provide for administrative leave to be the appropriate remedy. There is merit, however, in the service's argument concerning Article 88D. There is no evidence in the file showing Kearney to be a 200-work-year post office, and I would be shocked to find that it was, and that's talking about CCAs, okay? So there's you another fantastic decision, probably the best one I got for you, talking about carriers that are told to sit on a stool, there's no work to do. And that's C36279. 36279, that's arbitrator Zach Morris. All right, third one is Nancy Hutt, and this is C17710. C17710. Discussion. In spite of the protestations by the service that no employee was directed to leave prior to the end of their tour, the evidence simply does not corroborate the assertion. There is no doubt the day was confusing and anxiety-producing for employees and management alike in an attempt to deliver the mail and keep the station operational. In the midst of the commotion and disorder with no telephone service or power to provide light, management imparted differing directives to employees. However, the fact remains that the carriers who were directed to leave or chose to leave the station had no work to perform, as there was no lighting and many of the alleys were obstructed for safe passage. The power outage was caused by the storm. The circumstances at the Tigard station met the published definition of an act of God contained in the pertinent manuals. The governor called a state of emergency while carriers were on their routes. The situation was general in that it affected and impacted the community at large. The storm caused a power and phone outage in numerous areas, which included the Tigard station. Even though the storm had been predicted, the severity of the damage was a surprise and a challenge for the community. The loss of power and unavailability of backup lighting prevented a group of employees from continuing their work within Tigard station, and I love how she puts that verbiage in there. The loss of power and unavailability of backup lighting prevented a group of employees from continuing their work within Tigard station. The fact remains that some, not all carriers, were directed to leave. These carriers were not paid in accordance with Article 8. Rather, these carriers were directed to take annual leave or leave without pay. And for the carriers that were presented with an option, the options to stand around in an unproductive manner with no access to their case and no assignment of duties, the decision to leave was reasonable, justifiable, and somewhat involuntary. I'll read that again because here again, this is one of those that we're going to use in these files where management said, hey, there's no mail to deliver, no trucks come in, just sit on your stool and be unproductive. The fact remains that some, not all carriers, were directed to leave. These carriers are not paid in accordance with Article 8. Rather, these carriers are directed to take annual leave or leave without pay. And for the carriers that were presented with an option, the option to stand around in an unproductive manner with no access to their case and no assignment of duties, the decision to leave was reasonable, justifiable, and somewhat involuntary. Some carriers chose annual leave. Some carriers chose leave without pay. Some carriers made no choice at all and have no recall of filling out a Form 3971. And some carriers assumed they would get paid for the remainder of their tour. It is not difficult to conclude a group of employees were impacted by the storm and were prevented from working. Although the Postal Service argued all the carriers had a choice to stay or leave and therefore the decision to leave was personal, the evidence of the union persuades the arbitrator otherwise. The denial of administrative leave under the facts of this case was in violation of the national agreement, and she sustained the grievance. And that's another fantastic one. Dealing with what we have read on social media, right, where management, there's no mail, no trucks, no nothing, no work, just sit on a stool or take annual. That's because they do not want to grant administrative leave. They're that big a piece of shit that they don't want to grant us administrative leave. They would rather sit on a stool and be unproductive or give us some form of busy work rather than do the right thing, grant us administrative leave, make us grieve that. I was on a Facebook post earlier when somebody said, management was giving carriers sick leave against their knowledge. And can we put that, submit to get that changed? Absolutely. And here's another thing. If a carrier calls in sick on the date of a snowstorm, I'm still going to fight for that carrier. I'm going to ask them, why did you take sick leave? I didn't know what leave to take. Nobody's ever instructed me that there was something for a natural disaster or an act of God. I didn't want to use my annual because I wasn't on recreation. I wasn't on my time. I wanted to save that. And so you took sick leave. Why? Because I didn't know what else to take. I'm going to fight for that. I'm going to fight for that. If I lose it, I lose it. But I'm going to fight for that. Now I got into it with somebody that they were kind of coming at me about saying that, but if you'd have annual leave or sick leave or leave without pay beforehand, I'm not going to win that grievance. It states that in the M. But if you take sick leave because you didn't want to use your annual, because you didn't want to take leave without pay, and you come in and you say, I didn't know what to take, I just didn't want to take my annual, I'm going to fight for that carrier. I'm just going to fight for them. Am I going to win it? I don't know. But I'm going to fight for them. I'm going to show that I'm going to fight for them anyway. And I'm going to show that they've never been told what to take. Emergency annual leave, what if they didn't know there was such a thing? And so we'll get a very detailed statement of that fact. But this post was about somebody that said that management was just arbitrarily changing their leave to sick leave. And yes, we'll definitely get a statement that I did not take sick leave and they just gave me gave me sick. I put in for annual, they gave me sick, right? So that's C17710. 17710. That's Nancy Hutt. All right, this next one is C30400. 30400, and it's Joseph Harris. The union sufficiently proved that the storm on December 27th of 2010 was an act of God, as described in ELM 519.211. First, the storm qualifies as a community disaster since the governor declared a statewide state of emergency. Second, it was general in scope and impact because the large majority of Iceland's scheduled postal employees, approximately 70%, did not report to work. Management argues that the instant case does not meet the definition of a community disaster as described by arbitrator Robert Tim Brown. However, in the case of the Paramus post office, about 60% of the facility's employees did not manage to get to work. In the instant case, roughly 70% of the scheduled employees were absent. As arbitrator Brown notes, what is required is actual conditions that reasonably prevent employees in large numbers from getting to work. The conditions of the storm in Iceland sufficiently satisfy the requirements of the M 519.211. The occurrence of an act of God does not remove the union's burden of proof. However, management is obligated to investigate an individual employee's attempt to get to work in order to address the employee's request for administrative leave, and that's why I want this one. Again, management's going to deny all administrative leave. They're just going to do it, either from the district level or above that. They're going to deny administrative leave and make us fight for it. These are the things that we can use against them when we get into arbitration. I'll read this again. The occurrence of an act of God does not remove the union's burden of proof. However, management is obligated to investigate an individual employee's attempt to get to work in order to address the employee's request for administrative leave. Alice Newman's December 26, 2010 memo is a guideline for such efforts. Management rightly argues that it is not required to follow these directives exactly, But M 519-213 does require postmasters to determine whether absences from duty allegedly due to acts of God were in fact due to such cause, or whether the employee or employees in question could, with reasonable diligence, have reported to duty. The failure to conduct an investigation, as outlined in Alice Newman's memo, suggests that the postmaster's denial of administrative leave is arbitrary, and that's what 99% of our cases are going to be dealing with. An arbitrary decision by a district or the postmaster, we're just not going to grant administrative leave. This leaves the employee with no recourse but the grievance process. Management contends that the grievance written statements are insufficient to merit administrative leave, as the grievant made a personal decision not to try to come to work. Postmaster Chano stated that the Iceland post office remained open on December 27, 2010, despite the storm, and that other employees from other parts of the state and from out of state managed to report to work. He denied the grievance statements and testimony showed a significant attempt to report to work. See, they're elevating that, right? Significant attempt to report to work. The fact that the Iceland post office remained open during the storm does not preclude the approval of administrative leave. Section 513.211 does not require that an office be closed before the employee may receive administrative leave. The grievance testimony and written statements demonstrate reasonable diligence. Now, what did management state up here? A significant attempt to report to work. There's no requirement of a significant attempt to report to work. It's reasonable diligence, and we went over that with Arbitrator August, right? The grievance remained in contact with the post office via 204B Tom Cito. Throughout the morning, Mr. Cito has confirmed the accuracy of the grievance statement and testimony. The grievant testified credibly that he spent roughly 2.5 hours shoveling his car out of his parking space and that his apartment complex was not plowed until approximately 3 o'clock p.m. He had no access to bus transportation as all bus service in the area was suspended. He testified that he went onto the net and learned that New Jersey Transit train service was suspended. Management showed, in contrast, that although bus service was suspended, New Jersey Transit had scheduled limited train service, and the train stop was 1/4 of a mile from the post office. There neither the employee nor the union provided testimony or evidence as to where the grievant would have boarded the train. This was a weakness in the union's case. It was also a weakness in the services case, inasmuch as common sense and the guidelines assign their supervisor the responsibility to determine the nearest bus stop, train station, taxi stand, when determining whether the employee made due diligence efforts to get to work. This requirement has no meaning unless it refers to the train station, that is the nearest to the grievant's home. On balance, however, I conclude that the grievant successfully carried his burden of showing he made due diligent efforts to get to work. Some arbitrators, such as Arbitrator Rosalind Rosenberg, have argued that bad conditions are sometimes a function of where a grievant lives, a personal circumstance that therefore disqualifies a claim to administrative leave. I agree with that general proposition, but not with the extreme extent to which she carries it, as she argues that roads blocked by stalled cars and the lack of street plowing in the neighborhoods were all problems based on the personal circumstances where employees lived. I do agree with the service that those who live a great distance from work in an isolated rural area should not receive special consideration from the service. Additionally, I would add that someone who chooses to live at the top of a private, long, inclined driveway or in some other unserviced or environmentally difficult location should not receive a special consideration from the service. However, the grievant lived in a gated community, which is a common living situation and one in which general management provides proper services to its residents. The grievant did not know if the township or a private firm is responsible for plowing his apartment complex. Some might argue that a private plowing firm would be more reliable than municipal street maintenance efforts. Either way, in the case of a statewide emergency, the failure of either is beyond the control of the grievant and not the result of a personal circumstance. Similarly, the cancellation of all bus service that limits and delays of train service during the storm only serves as a testament to the severe nature of the act of God. The union successfully proved that the storm on December 27th was an act of God that merits administrative leave. The union's testimony at arbitration shows due diligence on behalf of the grievant. management violated Article 10 of the agreement when it denied the agreement administrative leave. And so there's another good one, right? Management has a responsibility to investigate. That's C30400. C30400. And that's Joseph Harris. All right, the next one, we got two more. Y'all hang in there with me. C32578, 32578, arbitrator Catherine Durham. Opinion: when a grievance alleges a contractual violation, the union normally bears the burden of proof. In M51921 cases, however, the parties often dispute where the burden of proof lies. This is because the language of 519.213 appears to require management to determine whether absences are truly related to an act of God. Management correctly points out that the criteria used to make this determination are: 1, there was an act of God; 2, the disaster was general rather than personal in scope and nature; 3, the disaster prevented groups of employees from reporting to work; and 4, the employees who did not report to work could not have done so if they had used reasonable diligence. The undersigned has previously held that in a 519.213 grievance, the union must make a prima facie case by showing that there is some evidence in the file based on which management was placed on notice that it needed to do an investigation in order to determine the cause of employees' absences during a snowstorm or other act of God. Statements from carriers saying that they were unable to report to work due to road or weather conditions are sufficient to carry this prima facie burden. In this case, not only the 6 employee statements, but also other uncontroverted facts should have triggered an investigation on management's part. And that's the reason I like this one. Again, it goes back to making management do some form of investigation. We're going to make that a huge contention of ours because management's not going to do it because they're too damn lazy, right? I'll read that part again. The undersigned has previously held that in 519.213 grievances, the union must make a prima facie case by showing that there is some evidence in the file based on which management was placed on notice that it needed to do an investigation in order to determine the cause of employees' absences during a snowstorm or other act of God. Statements from carriers saying that they were unable to report to work due to road or weather conditions are sufficient to carry this prima facie burden. And that's why statements are imperative, okay? Statements from every single carrier. What did you attempt to do to get to work? Not just, hey, it snowed a lot and I was scared. What attempts did you make to get to work? A very simple statement. And he's saying, hey, that's prima facie case for me. That's enough to carry that burden. Once you carry that burden, it's up to management to do an investigation, which they will never do. In this case, not only the 6 employee statements, but also other uncontroverted facts should have triggered an investigation on management's part. The fact that 67% of carriers did not report for work, the allegation in the file that a supervisor told at least one carrier to stay home and be safe, the fact that federal, state, and local government offices were closed, and most notably, the fact that the postal processing operation had been curtailed and there was no trucks delivered mail stations on January 25th. Once the union made this initial showing, the M placed the burden on management to make a determination regarding each employee's reasonable diligence or lack thereof. In this respect, broad general contentions along the lines that some employees were able to get to work, therefore anyone who did not report to work must not have exercised reasonable diligence, or that postal employees are required to take greater risks to report to work than members of the general public are insufficient. Management made no effort to ascertain the commuting circumstances of the 63% of carriers who did not report for duty on January 25th of 2016. Instead, based on one-sided case, management seems to assert that all employees must drive four-wheel drive vehicles in order to be reasonably diligent. Management also claims that the employees who are able to report to work use the same roads as employees who are not able to report. Neither of these assertions is reasonable or supported by fact. Further, those kinds of assertions ignore the particular circumstances, Washington, D.C., and the use of public transportation, which according to newspaper reports was extremely limited. There again, it's a great job of us putting in newspaper reports on January 25th. In this case, the union met its prima facie showing that groups of employees, 63% of carriers at the Silver Spring Annex, were unable to report to work due to general conditions, snowed-in roads, and limited public transportation. That resulted from a severe snowstorm that had already been recognized by the district manager as an act of God. Management failed to make any inquiry towards its burden to determine whether absences from duty allegedly due to acts of God were in fact due to such cause, or whether the employee or employees in question could, with reasonable diligence, have reported for duty as required by ELM 519-213. Local officials failed to inquire and look into the commuting conditions for the 63% of carriers who were unable to report for duty on January 25th. The union has requested a remedy not only for those employees who did not report for duty on January 25th, but also for those who did. While the undersigned appreciates the inconvenience and perhaps risk to safety posed to those employees who were told the annex was open and arrived only to find no work to do, the national agreement does not provide for any kind of compensation in such circumstances. The undersigned does not have jurisdiction to make a determination that the annex should have been closed on January 25th. And so there you have another decision. 32578. 32578, Catherine Durham. And let's get to this last one so I can let y'all go. The last one is 34064. C34064. And this is Glennis Gilder, arbitrator Gilder. The threshold issue to be addressed is whether the March 13th weather event constituted an act of God within the meaning of ELM 545-211, so as to justify management granting employee administrative leave. The phrase act of God is a term of art generally used to describe natural phenomenon of a catastrophic nature such as storms, earthquakes, fires, and floods. Events that for the most part happen without human interference having a widespread impact. The March 13th snowstorm in Colorado Springs appears to be an event that meets that characterization. The storm did not cause isolated incidents of influence in the Colorado Springs community. The weather conditions trapped hundreds of drivers on the roads, resulting in approximately 1,200 abandoned vehicles. Red Cross shelters were set up to provide succor, and as has been stated, the governor enlisted the National Guard in supplying assistance to area residents. While the management advocate advised only 3.5 inches of snow fell, one news reported noted 10 inches of drifts of snow, and the storm's winds were repeatedly at hurricane strength. This wasn't just a regular, ordinary, or average storm. This was a weather event with considerable strength and impact. While it did not reach apocalyptic conditions, the storm was severe enough to cause a major disruption to the Colorado Springs community's life. It is no stretch of the imagination to consider this storm an act of God within the meaning of the applicable ELM provision. Having determined the March 13th storm falls within the category of an act of God, the next inquiry is regarding management's decision not to authorize administrative leave for employees who elected to leave work early. While it may have been management's intention to have employees recalled to their respective facilities early, perform work duties in-house to complete their 8-hour workday, the reality of what occurred fell short. The union submitted ample testimony from affected employees that it only took them a few minutes to recase their undelivered mail and scan their undelivered parcels as weather delayed. It doesn't appear that there was sufficient work available to fully occupy the employees for the remainder of the work day. In addition, there was conflicting accounts regarding whether work was offered to the employees or whether they were, as the majority testified, left to their own devices to find duties with which to occupy themselves. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Matter of fact, when I was looking at social media, there are people saying, hey, we just bring board games and play all day. Or we just go and get pizzas and eat pizzas and other stuff. Why would we do that? Why would we let management sit there and treat us like that? You got a family at home. And management's going to tell you, hey, you got no work to do. Just find something to do for 8 hours. Just make yourself busy. And we just say, okay, we'll do that. I'm not doing that. If you don't have any work for me to do, I'm going home, and I'm going to file a grievance for administrative leave. And that's what she says. The union submitted ample testimony from affected employees that it only took them a few minutes to recase their undeliverable mail and scan their undelivered packages as weather delayed. It doesn't appear that there was sufficient work available to fully occupy the employees for the remainder of the workday. In addition, there was conflicting accounts regarding whether work was offered to the employees or whether they were, as a majority testified, left to their own devices to find duties with which to occupy themselves. Management places great weight on the fact 13 employees remained at their facilities and completed their workday. However, there's nothing was submitted that would indicate those 13 employees spent the remaining hours of their tours engaged in meaningful work, or whether they were just present at the facility instead of trying to make their way home. Employees are understandably vigilant regarding malingering. However, in the instant matter, the impacted employees were legitimately affected by a weather event of considerable strength and breadth. The March 13th storm was a condition beyond the control of management, one which could not reasonably have been anticipated or prepared for by the service. Employees were recalled out of the concern for their safety and prevented from accomplishing their appointed rounds. That they could not complete their work day as usual was no fault of their own. Likewise, they should not be penalized for opting to leave the facility when no work duties were available to occupy them for the remainder of the day. And then she sustained the grievance and gave them admin leave. And so there's some fantastic decisions for what mostly we were dealing with. We came in, there was no trucks, there was no mail. Management said, hey, you can take annual leave or you can sit on your stool all day. A foolish instruction on their part to say, hey, I have no meaningful work. Just sit there and find something to do, but I'm not going to pay administrative leave. I'm not doing that. And there's just some great sites to support that, all right? Because to me, it's completely idiotic to do that. To sit there and tell groups of carriers that sacrificed life and limb to come in, and you say, hey, you got here, I appreciate that. I'm not giving you administrative leave. We have no mail to deliver. There's nothing for you to do. Sit on that stool right there because I have to be here with my miserable self and go on these teleconferences and talk about how we're going to fuck the carrier over by not giving them administrative leave and just tell them to sit on a fucking stool all day and tell them to play games and eat pizza. I'm not doing that. And so there's you some sites for you, all right? So, there's the last episode. The last episode of Snow Daze, Episode 4. So hopefully y'all enjoyed that. Hopefully it's helped you in dealing with the act of God. Again, the best thing that's going to help you is going on from 8arbitration.com and going to episode 137. And JB has a fantastic episode on acts of God. 137, all right? So there's you a bunch of stuff over the last 4 episodes that try to help you with an act of God, because if anything happened this week, it was an act of God with that storm that rolled through the entire country, all right? So y'all have a fantastic rest of the week. Y'all please be safe. Still cold. Looks like another thing's coming this weekend. For those of you who don't have power, I hope that everything works out for you. Like I said, I've been in a hotel for the last 3 days, looking like it might be the rest of the week. And so I'll talk to y'all Sunday. We'll get into some shit together. I love you, Light Blue, very much. And I will talk to y'all Sunday.